Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Resilient Mind podcast with Andrew and Steve. I'm Steve Nathanson here with my very good friend, Andrew Marangoni. And I'm so excited because I think this is going to be a really interesting conversation today on leadership. So, Andrew, I'm actually really excited to hear your thoughts on this topic. To kick it off, I'm going to ask the audience real quick the question that we were just talking about of how do we define differences, say, between leadership and management? So what I posed to Andrew just a moment ago was, if I gave you two options to fill in the blank, and your options are people and task, where would each word go? The first fill in the blank would be leadership is blank oriented, and management is blank oriented. So which word belongs with which statement? So, Andrew, I know you answered that a moment ago. So if you would be so kind, would you kindly answer that for our folks?
Sure. And, even in those few moments in between when we just talked about it and when we started recording, I actually had a thought, which is instead of people, beings, because all things can be led. And the importance of how you're being in your leadership is so relevant too. So leadership is the action of working with beings, and management is the action of task-oriented goals. Right? Which is very interesting to me. And what came up for me was we were talking about John Maxwell's 5 levels of leadership, and we were talking about the first level of leadership, which is positional leadership, which is your typical manager. Is they have a role. People respect the role sometimes.
Yes.
They're at least designed to believe that respecting that role is in their best interest, which is part of management, is creating a organizational, environmental checks and balances to create good organizations around tasks. And, from a dog training perspective, it's where we start with dogs too, is before you train a dog, we have to manage the dog. And in that, it's all task oriented, is we are controlling the environment and controlling what we can to set the dog up to understand, here are the expectations. And same thing would go in the workplace is, you get a handbook, you get some training, you get some, time to say, here are your expectations. And here are the rules and guidelines. And if you follow them, this is how it goes. Now, when we talk about leadership, we talk about moving it into more of a permissive level where you are connecting with the beings that you are leading, and there is trust built, and there is more than just stringent checks and balances to maintain behavior or competency. There is motivation, there's inspiration, there's desire, and there's passion there.
Yeah, and it's fair. So if we take a look at that, one thing I feel which would relate that first level quite well right now is, throughout the past couple years, when everyone's been forced to be mainly remote in work, communication has become very transactional. We've lost that touch. We've lost the in-person, those intangibles, right? The 5-minute, say, flybys and just catching up, or the cooler talk, if you will. We typically don't reach out to folks unless it's work related. I need something to get done, or I've got questions on this specific item. It's become very transactional. And I think that's a really good relatable way of this first level of leadership. It's very transactional. It's focused on, I've got tasks. How do I get that done? This is what others need to do. And it's not getting into the human connection element that, right, the higher levels of leadership do, as we're talking about Maxwell's 5 levels of leadership. The very bottom is essentially very transactional in nature. It's very much task oriented, or really management versus leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've said it before on this podcast, is that people don't quit jobs, they quit bad managers or bad bosses.
Right.
And the hardest part about being a manager that doesn't work on their self-development and leadership is that when you're not creating that connection and the flow and everything that is important about getting to know what intrinsically motivates the people who you are working with so that you can get the best out of them. You can really drown in the woes of being a manager, being stuck in trying to use the system as leverage to get what you want out of people, instead of taking the extra time to find out what is going on with this person or this being. Sometimes it's an animal and you can't just ask, you have to observe. But getting an idea, where's this coming from? And even being, somewhat savvy in deconstructing people's communication, where they say something, but you can hear the underlying tones behind it. Because people are really clever in trying to manipulate people with their conversation to get what they want, and sometimes can be very coercive in how they lay out what they're saying to people. So it takes some talent to hear those types of things. And what I think a good leader can do, and I know you're about to jump in, is when you hear something from that person, instead of responding to it, give them a moment and reflect it back to them and say, what I just heard from you is this. Is that what I'm hearing correct? Right? That little skill. So what do you have to say, sir?
Yeah, it's good points on really that second level, right? The permission level of relationship building, right? That's the foundational relationships between, say, leader and the folks that they are leading. And part of what you're describing when you're talking about, say, other beings, where you can't say ask and your dogs can't speak back to you, it's observing the observations you have. And it really gets down to emotional intelligence, if you will, your social intelligence, your ability to really be able to digest the nonverbals, to form solid relationships with people that get you over that hurdle of, say, people being coercive, because they are going to become quote unquote followers. I put that in quotations because it's not someone who's just going to absolutely fall on the sword and follow you to the ends of the earth. But it's someone who's going to respect you, be willing to go on that journey with you, because they do trust in you as the leader, and that they believe you have their best interest at heart. And you may be able to create that kind of fervence. There's a lot of that in different styles of leadership and different leaders that we see. But that's what this second level really is about, creating those relationships that form that bond between leader and the person who is being led. And I think you have great observations on how do we do that. It's our own emotional intelligence. It's our social intelligence on how we interact with them. Part of it as a leader, if you recognize people who maybe have ill intent, is how do we bring that person back in the fold? It's the same thing for us as human beings. We may recognize leaders have ill intent. And it's a great, actually, I think, point for those who are listening about leadership. If it's clear to others that we're just being coercive, we don't care about them, we're just stepping over people to advance our own career, or we're really just in it for us and we don't care about the other people, or certainly the people we're leading, that's very clear to people. We naturally have an ability to really read on people who are being authentic and people who are being inauthentic. So perhaps a word of caution as you're building out that second level of leadership and creating relationships. If you're not being authentic, if you don't truly care about those that you lead, guess what? That's going to be very clear to them. And that's not going to help us advance past really that first level of leadership. That's more management and transactional in nature.
Right. And, part of it is understanding when I'm not getting what I want out of my people, what am I doing to create that versus why aren't they doing what I'm asking them? Is where's the disconnect? What's in the gap?
Yep.
Right? Is taking some being responsible in that moment and saying, as the leader of this organization, this is happening. So I am responsible either from a early stage of not setting them up to get to the point where I want them, or at some point there's a breakdown and we need to address that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the hardest things for leaders to do is show up during breakdown. Everyone's a good leader when everything's going well.
Yeah, there's truth in that statement.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. If you work in a functionable business that has a lot of things going for, and then all of a sudden you end up the manager there, and everyone's pretty happy with their work environment and all that stuff, and you're just kind of stepping into that, it can be very easy sometimes for you to look good until things go awry. And that's where actually your leadership will be shown.
Yeah.
Because it is, again, it's real easy to show up when everything's going the way the organization, the way the followers, the employees, or whatever is in the proverbial basket. But when you're in breakdown, how do you show up? And how do you clear breakdowns? How do you manage breakdowns? How do you help breakdowns create into breakthroughs? Because at the end of every breakdown, there's a breakthrough. And a lot of times for you, being the leader, is this breakdown means that I didn't do something at some point that I need to address. And that's my breakthrough is, here's the area where I get to fix that or improve that or be aware that that's a possibility there.
Yeah. And one of the things that really helps those times be easier is having strong relationships between you and the folks that you're leading. If we just step back one moment and take a look at that, there's a reason I feel that the relationship piece is very foundational in terms of Maxwell's theory, or 5 levels, right? That second level we're talking about. Because one of the most common questions I get asked by leaders that I work with is, how do I motivate people? What motivates them? How do I figure that out? And it's a great segue, honestly, into the 3rd level of leadership, right? The production level, because I think that's where we're really getting into truly motivating people, because when we motivate them, we're going to increase that productivity. I view the relationship piece as foundational because to really understand what motivates people, I think you need to truly understand them. We're each uniquely motivated, and there are things that we've talked about on this podcast before of how you can easily chunk up motivation into different buckets, how to explore what is going to motivate people. But if we don't have that relationship or openness where we can communicate with them, where we're observing them, looking at our emotional and social intelligence skill sets that are foundational to the relationship piece, we're maybe not going to be able to truly understand what motivates people. So I think there's a great point in how the levels are kind of laid out and how it kind of jumps us into that 3rd tier of production, because once we understand who people are and we have a strong bond with them, it's easier to know how can we best motivate them, particularly in times when things maybe aren't going right. What's going to help us get the team to move forward together collectively in a way that's going to bring us together, make us stronger, versus breaking us apart and causing infighting and bickering during that time that can ultimately break that team apart and cause us to never maybe reach that high production level as a team.
Right. It's back to the old saying is you're only as strong as your weakest link. So in the chain, if there's a weak link, you need to address that. And there doesn't mean that there's anything wrong there. It just means that there is an area of improvement
Mm.
that can be addressed. And when we look at it as an area of improvement versus a weakness, it already is more motivating to get into the what's going on here than, oh, we need to address your weaknesses.
Yeah.
Right. It's as simple as talking to your people, is make the connection. Hey, Steve, how you doing today?
Yeah.
How's things been going? What would it look like if you had your way in this organization? What would you improve? Right? Like, even asking questions like that, even theoretical questions, to say, like, let's throw the whole organization out the window. If you were in charge, Steve, how would you run things?
Yeah.
At least get an idea of how they're thinking, and you probably are going to get an inkling of their motivation and what inspires them, and then you can start working and creating on those things.
It's actually a beautiful segue into that next level, right? The level 4 level leadership is people development, where essentially you're growing additional leaders, right? So you're building out the skill set of the organization by, it's not copying you, it's building out additional leaders through coaching and developing the folks that are following you, the folks that you are leading, to be leaders themselves, build out that skill set. And you're asking great questions, Andrew, because when you're showing them as a leader that you truly care about them and that they're valued, not only are they going to be more willing to put in time and effort and work, which is going to be on the motivation factor and the production piece, but they're also going to feel like, you know what, this is something maybe I want to maintain in the long term. And there's actually growth and development opportunities for me here because I'm being valued. And that's one of the biggest reasons people leave jobs right now, is lack of career development, lack of growth opportunities. We don't even see that that's a possibility in our organization. As a leader, though, if you can ask these questions, bring people into the fold and foster them, you can also inherently teach them the skill sets that they're going to need as leaders, and you can coach and develop them into that skill set, which is going to lift the organization up as a whole. And that's that 4th level of leadership, is you're now stepping out of your role in terms of what you've got to get done and how you're resonating with people to really build out additional leaders in the organization to uplift everybody even further.
Right. Actually, there's a really significant phenomenon in nature's leadership with geese. So we know geese fly in that V formation. Now, a lot of people just think that it's a natural occurring, like this is a flight pattern, but there is an actual aerodynamic principle of that lead bird creating a break in airflow, which creates less resistance for the rest of the organization, basically. Now, here's the really interesting part about it is that lead bird takes the brunt of a lot of things, and it gets tired and needs to rest. And eventually will fall back to a different position and another bird will take its place. And that is great organizational leadership there, because at some point you can't do it all yourself. You're going to need others to, break the wind so that you can coast behind them and work on, what you had led in past journey. And I think that is an amazing illustration of leadership amongst beings, right? The other cool thing about geese is if one gets injured, 2 will go down and make sure that geese either gets back up with them or they stay with them until they pass. So there's a really intricate dynamic of leadership among geese. And I think that's actually really beautiful and inspirational.
This is something I think we'll talk about in the future on the podcast, but you're getting into a couple points I feel is essentially succession planning and delegation, right? At what point do I have to say maybe no as a leader? That's partially the third area, actually. And then how do I delegate effectively to folks? Because there are a lot of things that need to get done, and it doesn't all have to be on me. But how do I do that in the vein of coaching and developing others? And then to your point, people don't necessarily stay around for years on end anymore, or when things happen in life and people move on for one reason or another. How do we successfully plan to fill that gap and raise people up to be able to build out the organization and maintain it should something like that happen? Or maybe in the best vein, how do we build people up in the organization and then give them particular opportunities that may help grow and develop the business, like a new line of business, a new product, something where maybe they can help spearhead the organization into somewhere different. And because of what you've done as a leader, you now have the confidence that they're able to undertake that task and continue to advance the organization forward. It's interesting. That's what I took away, I think, from the geese analogy is there's a strong bonding connection there, right? There's not leaving any geese behind, essentially, as well, but ensuring that the path is followed, not just from, hey, this is what we have to get done as an organization, but followed because there's a true connection there.
Right. And, I think that's where we talk about like mission and vision statements of an organization being important, is that anyone in the organization should intrinsically hold those values, or they probably don't belong there.
Yeah. And we may actually be naturally kind of shifting into that last level of leadership, right? The pinnacle level of leadership. This is the level that really is fervence, essentially. It's transformational. It's transcendence. You've now essentially gone the full shift from pure transaction as a leader to someone who's transformational in terms of not only lifting up everybody else, but you lift up yourself in there. It's something that causes us to go beyond where we naturally normally would have gone before. So I think there's a lot of great examples that we've seen in our country actually around this. I mean, Steve Jobs actually is a name that jumps out to me. I think there's a lot of fervence that he created in Apple. And then what Apple did, it did really transform where we are today. The iPhone, the i product line transformed, I think, how we operate societally, how he engaged with people, how you raise that level. There's a certain type of transcendence there and transformationalism, because he took Apple from where they were and they skyrocketed beyond where they maybe naturally would have maintained if he hadn't been the leader. And if I'm not, misquoting the way that people felt about him internally in that organization, people loved him. People loved what he created and how he related to folks. And he was able to transcend himself, them, and thereby the organization. And if I'm not missing the mark, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, but that's the pinnacle level, I think, that Maxwell describes in the 5 levels of leadership.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that transformational piece where you have invoked your mission and vision so well that everything is just going on all cylinders, and people, not to say that there's not breakdown ever, but people are resilient to it. They work through it. They work together. They don't let it hinder them. They don't get stuck in resistance or resentment.
Yeah.
It's a part of life is breakdown. And addressing the breakdown appropriately is probably one of the biggest distinctions of leadership there is. So yeah, the pinnacle is getting to that place of transformation where it's so second nature to you of how you've been practicing being a leader to these people and practicing your vision and your mission day in and day out with passion creates that movement, that thing that we feel, that connectivity, that deeperness, that, oh, you and I, we share this. We're part of this together. That to me, is transformational leadership.
Yeah.
And sometimes it happens in organizations, and sometimes it happens in other avenues where it is, the leader is really good at all these things, but maybe have a really different idea of what the world looks like. We call those cults. But at the same point, you can't take away from those people's leadership ability, right? Is some of them can be incredibly, they're all, I think we're going to talk about this in a different podcast, but the different styles of leadership.
Yep. We can talk about that more as we come along.
Yeah, because you can become incredibly powerful and influential through tyranny and fear and intimidation, or you can do it through love, respect, and other aspects.
For the record, by the way, which is what we support on this podcast.
Yes, the latter.
Just for clarity there. Not that you weren't saying otherwise, but and it is a valuable illustration because it can be very difficult to look at leaders in history that are just, say, completely misaligned 180 degrees from our values. But there's still something there in the way that they were able to do that, right? Whether we agree with it or not, or how strongly we disagree with it, there's something there. And I'll maybe give a lighter example of that. I'm not a huge Tom Brady fan, but I can't deny the talent that he has. He's a very talented quarterback. Being a Steelers fan and watching him rip us apart many championship games, there's a little bit natural of a dislike that happens there. But he is a very talented human being. So, right, if I put aside, say, how much he's beaten the Steelers over the year, and I just look at what he's been able to do, I can't deny the talent that does exist there and what he's been able to accomplish. And that's what we're talking about here in these kind of leaders that maybe don't align with our values and have done maybe bad things in life. There's still that ability that they had to get that many followers to be able to do that. And that is worth a conversation because it does align with our leadership that we're talking about, but we're talking about just aligning it for the good, for building transcendence and transformationalism in something that aligns with good moral values, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, yeah. It totally makes sense. And, in dog training, I always try to look at it this way is there are a lot of people break it down into what's working or not working. And there are lots of things in leadership that work that aren't aligned with my values and principles. And I'm not going to say that they aren't effective, but I would say that I want to know what part of that is being effective, and is there anything in that I can see value in that I can align with my values and principles. If not, I can, just agree to disagree and look at it as, well, that's working for you and what you are doing. From my perspective, I see this possibility for fallout or this possibility for undesired outcomes because of the process of what you think works. Whereas with my leadership is I always try to say, like, I'm more focused on the way that I am going through the process and making sure that the process is sustainable, attainable, and is the best results with the most the most amount of gain possible with the least amount of sacrifice.
Yeah, and maybe the best way of describing what you're bringing out, what we're talking about here, is what really helps resonate with folks. It is that mission, that purpose, the values that you share, the shared, say, vision of the world that you want to create. Regardless of the kind of leader we're talking about that have done some very great things in life or have done some very terrible things in life, what they united people around was that shared vision, the shared mission, the purpose that they all felt like they served, and the values that they held. Now, again, we will always hold things that are going to better this society for the overall good. That's who Andrew and I are. And to that point, part of that is, as we go through this journey, how do we limit that, say, negative impact upon those that we are leading as a leader? That sacrifice, like you said. And some people, honestly, as leaders, they're more willing to take that on themselves in service of those that they're leading. And we're talking really now into about, say, servant leadership and that theory, which we can get into a little bit more later on into conversations. But for the moment, I want to take us back to these 5 levels of leadership that we've talked about, because we've really kind of gone the progression from purely transactional to transformational, and how we create, say, that fervorance and that true belief that we have in those leaders that's going to make us all rise above and get better. There's value in that. And the one thing I'll add real quick, I think, is Maxwell has given us a good roadmap for us individually as leaders that can start chipping away culturally in an organization. I think one of the most important pieces, though, is it often takes all of us to make this change happen. So the more leaders we can get that can really shift into this type of transformational leadership, this pinnacle level of leadership, the stronger that organization is going to get as a whole, and the more transformational that organization is going to get as a whole. So in order to really right this ship in organizations, it's going to take all of us to really buy in to this type of leadership style, this type of culture. So that's just one last point I wanted to make in there.
Yeah, and I completely agree, is that it is up to every individual and every organization to talk about what do we want to be creating in the world, instead of the narrative. It's called the what's the word I'm looking for? What's another word for mediocre?
So
the way things have always been is the way we're doing things. The bias,
status quo.
The status quo bias. There we go. The status quo bias, which is we've always done things this way. It's more work to change than it is to not change, and this is working. But again, if we're being responsible and reflective, what is working? What is not working? What is the price that we pay for what's working? What are the prices others pay for what's working? And, looking at all the components to that. Again, if you look at it as success is profitability, which is that you have gained more asset than you've cost in resource, period. But to look at that effectively, you don't just look at a balance sheet. You look at all the accounts in the accounting piece and look about each little, because there's places where you can tweak and move, and there's, the world is so finite. But I think what I'm saying is that in cultural organization, to break away from the status quo, what we need to do is first identify, are we being biased about the status quo? Second of all, is what would we rather be creating than what is currently here? And how effective is that? And if we are to be effective, what does that mean for the organization moving forward?
Yeah.
Right? And the more people who get into that line of thinking is we're pushing against being more motivational and inspirational in the world instead of getting it done, being task oriented, just saying like the job's finished, pay me.
Yeah. So in light of that, I think a good challenge we can throw out to our listeners today, honestly, is can we be open and honest with ourselves to be introspective about our organization and ask, where are we organizationally on our 5 levels of leadership? Because when we can be really truthful and honest about where we are, and we can be honest about maybe those biases that we have around the status quo, then we can actually start being open to the change and shifting and growing along this progression. So I think we'll leave it there today for you as good food for thought. And I want to say thank you as always for listening. And if you have any questions for Andrew or I, we're more than happy to hear you reach out to us. I'm more than happy to answer them. So until the next time, Andrew, be the movement in your life.
You too, buddy.